Hello and welcome to Getting It Done, the Hub Live's flagship event at Climate Week NYC 2021. I'm Nisha Pillay, your host, and there's an exciting and packed agenda coming up. We have less than 10 years to bend the arc of climate change. We have got to halve our emissions by 2030 if we have the faintest chance of reaching net zero by 2050. How on earth are we going to do it? Well, in a moment, we're going to be joined by COP26 President-designate Alok Sharma and the US Special Envoy on Climate Change, Secretary John Kerry, plus Bill Gates will be joining us too to share his vision of climate action. We'll also have some dynamic discussions between key stakeholders from business, government and NGOs, debating the critical milestones that must be met in the climate decade. We're here to share how we can all shift from ambition to action. And today's event, Getting It Done, is all about the how. Joining me now in the studio is Climate Group's CEO, Helen Clarkson. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you.
Big thank you to you and indeed everyone at Climate Group for putting on what's turned into such a successful event every year, Climate Week NYC.
Thank you.
I'd first like to ask you, Getting It Done, why did you choose this as the theme for this year's Climate Week NYC?
Well, you talked there in your introduction about some of the urgency, and we've really are seeing the urgency. We've had the IPCC report this summer talk about Code Red for humanity, and we wanted to push that point of urgency because we're getting lots of long-term commitments from businesses and governments. Those are really important, but we need to start acting on them now. We're not going to meet those commitments without actually starting the work.
So tell me about those commitments we keep hearing. Some of them are fantastically inspiring, decarbonise by 2045, decarbonise by 2050. But how are companies and governments actually going to get there?
Well, that's right. So you need to have those long-term commitments because that sets the vision, it sets you in the right direction. But then you need to sit down now and actually ask that question and make sure that climate is really at the centre of every decision that we take from now on. It's not going to happen by accident. You have to put climate at the centre, and we want to use Climate Week NYC to inspire companies, copy what others are doing, hear what they're doing. We've got to get there fast.
Thank you, Helen. Well, our big theme for today is getting it done. So let's get going, shall we? Up next, Helen will be discussing one of the critical moments in the climate decade, COP26, with Alok Sharma, President-designate of the UNFCCC's meeting in Glasgow this November. It's coming up now.
I'm joined now by Alok Sharma, COP President-designate. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know you must be incredibly busy, just 40 days to go till COP, and we know that meeting is absolutely critical if we're going to halve emissions this decade.
Well, Helen, thank you very much for having me on, and you're absolutely right. COP26 has to be the moment where we ensure that we are keeping 1.5 degrees within reach. Back in Paris in 2015, the countries of the world came together and said that they would work to ensure that global temperature rises were kept well below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5, and that's what we want coming out of Glasgow, for the world to come together and for us to be able to say with credibility that we have kept 1.5 within reach.
And at this Climate Week NYC, our theme is getting it done. And throughout the event today, we're talking about that and asking guests what their thoughts are about what needs to happen in the climate decade. Can you say a bit about what that success looks like coming out of COP26?
Yes, I mean, look, this is going to be the decisive decade, and I don't think I over-exaggerate when I say that COP26 is our last best chance of getting this right. You will have seen, everyone around the world will have seen what the IPCC report said in August, and it was pretty stark reading. And it said that it is absolutely human activity that is creating climate change. It said that the window on keeping 1.5 alive is closing, that there is still room for us to ensure that we can get there, but it is closing. And we are seeing the impacts on a daily basis around the world of climate change, millions and millions of people affected, whether it's in North America or in Europe or indeed in Asia. So we need to ensure that coming out of COP, we're able to say with credibility that we've kept 1.5 alive. And as part of that, I've had a very consistent message to countries around the world. Firstly, we want them to come up with ambitious plans to cut emissions, so those near-term 2030 emission reduction targets, but also to set out their commitments to go to net zero by the middle of the century. Now, we've seen some progress. So when we took on the presidency of COP26, we had less than 30% of the global economy covered by a net zero target. We're now at 70%, and of course, we want all countries to make that commitment. We also now are in a position where the G7 nations have collectively come together and have ambitious plans to cut emissions by 2030, which are then aligned with net zero by 2050. That, I think, is the very first time we have got to that point, and I do think that is incredibly important to highlight. But of course, what we need is every country to come forward. So, those large emitters, those G20 nations that have not yet come forward with ambitious commitments to do so. And there's an opportunity for them. We've got the UN General Assembly coming up, and that is a milestone on the road to COP26 and opportunities for countries to set out their ambitious plans to cut emissions. We also want to ensure that we've got countries coming forward with their plans to adapt to the climate change that is already happening around us. And the IPCC report was pretty clear. Even if climate change stopped, even if global warming stopped tomorrow, we will still see the impacts of climate change continuing and affecting millions of people around the world. And that's why we need to be able to adapt to the climate change that is happening. Thirdly, finance is a big issue. We've had the developed nations, the donor nations say back in 2009 that we would ensure $100 billion worth of support was going to be made available to developing countries from 2020 onwards every year up to 2025. We're not there yet. And therefore, we need to make sure that the developed nations step forward. And again, the UN General Assembly is another big moment for those countries that have not made commitments to come forward with finance. And finally, there is the issue of the outstanding elements of the Paris rulebook. Paris was a historic agreement, but it did leave some of the detailed rules to be sorted out afterwards. And we need to make sure that we finish off that Paris rulebook so we can operationalize and give full life to the Paris Agreement.
And just finishing off, the Climate Week NYC is about policy, but it's also about business action. We work also with state and regional governments, as you know. And so what role do you see those non-state actors, such as the private sector, playing in Glasgow?
Well, the private sector has a vital role to play. And what I can tell you, what I've been incredibly encouraged by in this role is when I have talked to businesses, when I've talked to governments, and when I've talked to civil society, they are all speaking from the same voice now. We're at a point where I think we are beyond this inflection point where absolutely everybody understands why we need to take action and tackle climate change. You've seen the UN's Race to Zero campaign that's being run by the high-level champions for COP26 and COP25, and there's been huge progress, huge numbers of global companies that have signed up to this, a significant number of cities, regions around the world have signed up to this. And when I speak to businesses, they absolutely get this. And there are three reasons I think businesses are very keen to move forward on a green agenda. The first is, they do think it's a right thing to do, and therefore this is the approach that they're taking. Secondly, it's what their clients and customers are asking for. And thirdly, they have seen that actually green growth is also good for the bottom line. In the UK, we have managed to grow our economy by almost 80% over the last 30 years, but at the same time, we had cut emissions by over 40%. And if you look at the companies around the world who are making commitments, whether it is those who manufacture motor vehicles, who are setting out their plans to go to electric vehicles, or it is people investing in renewable energy, there is a real momentum. And one of the areas that I've been incredibly encouraged, because my background is finance before I came into politics, is the finance sector. We have a grouping called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which now represents around $88 trillion of assets. Asset managers, fund managers who've signed up to make sure that they go to net zero by 2050. What we now need to do is to ensure that that money is also being helped to be channeled into developing countries, into climate resilient infrastructure. And that's why finance is so vitally important. Without finance, a lot of what we want to see, a lot of the changes we want to see are really going to be very, very difficult to undertake.
Thank you so much, COP President Designate. Thank you for joining us today, and I can't wait to see you in person in Glasgow in November.
Looking forward to it, Helen.
Thank you to Alok Sharma for taking the time to speak with us today. And our next guest is working on the front line of climate diplomacy and has been tasked with rebuilding the American climate agenda on the international stage. I'm joined by the US Special Presidential Climate Envoy, Secretary John Kerry. Thank you for joining us today, Secretary Kerry.
I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you.
A moment ago, we heard from COP26 President Delegate Alok Sharma. I wanted to pick up from this conversation where he touched on leadership and a real sense of urgency as we go into COP26. How are you bringing that level of urgency and thinking about COP, which is about 40 days away?
Well, we're bringing that level of urgency every single day in everything we're doing. We've been working for 6 months, since January 20th, when President Biden was sworn in. And immediately that day rejoined the Paris Agreement, which I had the privilege of leading the negotiating team when we did it back in 2015. We are doing everything possible to raise ambition on a global basis. We're working with India for the deployment of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy, a remarkable goal set by Prime Minister Modi, which if it is achieved, helps India to be keeping faith with limiting the Earth's rise of temperature to 1.5 degrees. We're working with Russia, we're working with South Africa, with Indonesia, with Mexico, with countries all around the world in efforts to help where we can, to bring technology to the table, to bring finance to the table, to try to guarantee that globally we will be in a position, all of us, to raise ambition sufficiently that we can keep the hope of limiting the rise of temperature to 1.5 degrees, at least keep that hope alive through the next decade. And if we don't reduce enough emissions in the next decade, then we not only lose the 1.5, we wind up unable to achieve net zero by 2050. So the consequences of this decade's choices could not be greater. And we're already seeing, Mother Nature is sending the clearest signals ever about the rapidity with which the evidence is accelerating about the dire circumstances that are developing. And we have the latest IPCC report, which stresses that we've got to deploy renewables far faster, 6 times faster than we are today. We've got to begin reducing our dependency on the dirtiest fuel in the world, coal. And we have to do that 5 times faster than we're doing today. We have to do reforestation 5 times faster. We have to make the transition to electric vehicles happen about 22 times faster. So we are behind. That's the bottom line. And the consequences of being behind are storms that are far more intense, water that disappears, greater heat in various communities that become uninhabitable. And you can run a long list of these consequences. So all of this is at stake when we go to Glasgow. The world has an opportunity to come together, to join together, to take action globally in order to prevent the possibility of catastrophe developing because we didn't do enough over the course of the next 10 years.
Agreed, and really on that sense of urgency. And you talked there about going to India and heading off there and the other countries that you're going to, and it's fantastic seeing you travel around the world. But there are people who think that the last administration just caused irreversible damage to US climate diplomacy. Can you tell us a bit about how you're trying to restore trust with other countries, and especially with the Global South and developing countries?
Well, my goal is not specifically to restore trust. That's a byproduct of what we're doing. My goal, on behalf of President Biden, who summoned leaders from around the world to a leaders summit last April, which actually wound up getting 55% of global GDP committed to try to keep the limit of 1.5 degrees alive. That's remarkable. And so we're not consciously saying, oh my gosh, we've got to restore American credibility. It gets restored by acting. It gets restored by being out there doing the things that are necessary to address the issue, the fundamentals of the issue. And so from day one, we have been working to raise everybody's ambition. We know that the scientists have told us you've got to reduce your emissions globally by a minimum of 45% over the course of the next 10 years. President Biden has set a goal for the United States to achieve 50 to 52% reduction in that period of time. He set a goal for 2035. All the power produced in the United States will be carbon-free, not just coal-free, but carbon-free. He set a goal to make sure that by 2035, 50% of the total automobile fleet in the United States being sold will be electric. He's going to deploy 500,000 charging stations around the country. And all of this will create jobs. It'll create a cleaner future, healthier future for people, not to mention a far more secure future, because we won't be facing the threat of sending young Americans or people from other countries anywhere to defend our source of energy. This is a huge moment for the world. The consequences could not be greater. And so the United States is simply going to step up and do its part, as we did previously when we worked in 2013, beginning with our agreement with China to work together heading towards Paris. And we worked diligently under President Obama's leadership to make things happen then. We're going to do the same thing here under President Biden's leadership, and let the chips fall where they may as to people's judgment about what the United States is doing. I refuse to accept the idea that the sheer idiocy and lack of scientific rationale and legitimate economic rationale or even political rationale for Donald Trump pulling out. I refuse to believe that that creates something that's irreparable for people of good faith and good conscience who want to do what's right.
Thank you. And it's great to have the US back at the climate table. And it's great to have you here at Climate Week. Our theme for the week is getting it done. So my last question to you is, when you look at the next 12 months, how is the US going to be getting it done on climate?
Well, first of all, we're not going to get it done alone, that's for sure. No one nation can get this done. This gets done by the best of diplomacy and the best of international engagement coming together. And there are countries all around the world deeply committed to making this happen. I mean, we're working very closely with the EU. We're working very closely with partners with Japan, with Canada, with the UK, with countries around the world. And my sense is that there's a global growing awareness that knows we've got to respond, and we've got to respond quickly. There's also an interesting thing happening, which I find may be the thing that actually makes the greatest difference of all, and that is the private sector around the world is really moving. And CEOs have come to understand that this affects their lives, affects their personal lives, it affects their countries, it affects their ability to do business around the world without disruption, without terrible consequences. And everybody is realizing that it just doesn't make sense to spend more money cleaning up afterwards rather than investing in order to prevent bad things from happening in the first place. It is now clearly a fact. It is far, far less expensive to invest in the transition that deals with the climate crisis now rather than waiting for things to get worse and pretending you're going to deal with it in the future. And many of the things that are happening now, scientists will tell you that not only do they fear that we may have reached tipping points on the Arctic and the Antarctic and on coral reefs, but they see many of the changes that are taking place, if not all of them, as irreversible. That should scare the hell out of folks to say, hey, we can't be doing this to biodiversity, to the fundamentals of the chemistry of the ocean, the temperature of the ocean, to the ability of people to live where they have lived and want to live. We face the possibility of massive numbers of refugees, climate refugees, looking for places to live where they can actually grow their crops and live comfortably. And the world needs to understand the disruption and instability that could come with not paying attention to these trends that begin to emerge and which are clearly predictable. The consequences of not paying attention will be potential conflict, disruption, chaos in certain places, possible violence over the inability of people to actually have their food and be able to have a decent place to live. I mean, you know, it isn't hard to be able to read through all the books that have now predicted what will happen, all the scientific reports that predicted, and the most recent IPCC reports, which are the UN reports, which have just reinforced the fact that this is the decade to make the difference. The most important thing, we can make the difference. This is doable. It's not a lack of capacity, it's a lack of political will. And if we bring ourselves together in the next months, we have the ability to set out the course and the path that will create many, many more jobs, will improve people's health, improve our security, and address the climate crisis. That is in our hands. It's up to us. And I hope that Glasgow will embrace that choice and lay out the roadmap for people to get the job done.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Secretary Kerry, and really good luck for your travels around the world and your diplomacy as we run into COP26. And we look forward to seeing you in Glasgow.
Thank you so much.
For our next conversation, we'll be talking systems shifts and major milestones. In the next decade, we need to fundamentally shift some of our practices and systems if we stand a chance of halving emissions by 2030. And we have two guests to talk to us now about that. So Dr. Susan Gardner, Director of Ecosystems Division at UNEP, and Tom Howes, Head of Energy and Environment Division at the IEA, who've got a significant role in shifting those critical systems, but of course they can't do it alone. So let's start with, to reach net zero by 2050, as I said, we need to halve emissions by 2030. Are you optimistic that that's achievable? Susan, please start on that.
Well, I'm optimistic. I have to be optimistic, I think, in my job. But we've heard optimism from the Secretary General, who has just recently said in the Common Agenda that we're either headed for breakdown or breakthrough. Those are the options. So there is no other path, really. And our breakthrough is reaching net zero. That's our shot. We know that the triple planetary crises of climate, pollution, and nature are interconnected. But we also know that the solutions are interconnected. So the science that we have also shows us the way in terms of having a holistic approach that addresses them all together. We know that it's essential that we have rights at the center of any action. So Indigenous rights, local communities, looking with a vision to the next generation, all of this is essential for ensuring that we have empowered these champions of the future. So I think that taking bold action means really listening to the science that we have and knowing that this is the only option.
Thank you. Tom?
Thanks. Yes. I mean, from our side too, we are also optimistic. And I guess it comes despite of some of the recent evidence. We flagged up recently that emissions globally have rebounded after the dip from COVID, which one can see as a worrying signal. But at the same time, our data shows that there's been a massive rollout and expansion of e-vehicles. The growth in net renewable electricity capacity additions is reaching new high levels and is expected to grow. So there are good signs out there coming from the current investment and also from current government plans. There's over 50 governments who've committed to net zero targets, and that's just showing that governments are really taking this seriously now. And in addition to that, we of course produced our net zero roadmap last year, which really shows the one pathway for the world overall to get to net zero and the real practical ways to do that. We flagged up the massive investment needs that need to happen in clean tech. Investment basically has to triple to reach the levels of clean energy investment we need. But that will in itself stimulate new jobs and economic growth. We've got to try to create an electricity generation that's globally net zero by 2040. There's a major effort needed on increasing energy efficiency measures. These have dipped again during the COVID times, and energy efficiency is the the no-brainer that every government should be prioritising. So there are a range of different measures that our roadmap flags up to show that, yes, net zero is achievable, feasible, and we can be optimistic about it.
Great. So some optimism, but a lot there that needs to get done. How do we prioritise? You know, the theme of the event is getting it done. How do we get it done? What do we need to prioritise in the next few years? Tom, do you want to start on that one?
Sure. I mean, the IEA is all about providing governments around the world with good advice on how to make the energy transition happen as soon as possible. So we're full of good recommendations on that score. I mean, we flag up, again, I mentioned financing investment. We've just produced a new analysis there which talks about the different new financial mechanisms that we can be introducing to incentivize both public and private sector investment in clean tech, because the gap is enormous at the moment. The developing economies are averaging less than 150 billion a year in clean tech investment, and that needs to grow 5 times in the next decade to really stand a chance. So investment and financing is a number one issue to tackle. That's either directly with money through international financial institutions, but also improving the capital market environment in a range of developing countries to help lower the risks and lower the cost of capital. So those are the starting points, if you like.
Great. Susan?
Well, I agree with him completely that one of the ways we can incentivize private investments is through putting the support that we have for pandemic recovery behind green investments, behind smart choices for development. Right now, if you look at the 50 biggest economies, there's about almost $2 trillion that's been invested for pandemic recovery spending, but probably only about 18% of that is actually considered green investments. So we have to ensure that we're aligning financial investments with climate objectives. And that's essential, particularly when we think about nature-based solutions. We should be at least having 4-fold increases over the next decades, because these are solutions that are not only extremely cost effective, but they also provide not mitigation as well as adaptation and resilience benefits. And as I was talking about the triple planetary crisis before, at the same time you get these essential biodiversity benefits, which we know are so important in supporting economies in terms of whether it be food, whether it be water stability, or all of the other types of benefits and services that we get from ecosystems that we don't generally take account for in our economic and development planning. So I would say prioritizing having the investments right, having the investments green, and certainly the energy investments along the lines of correcting fossil fuel subsidies that provide the wrong incentives, curbing methane emissions. That is very high on the list of priorities, but ensuring also that in these transitions that they're just transitions that understand the development situations of each particular area, the workers, the businesses, and the regions in terms of what is the right path forward for each of them.
Right.
I'd echo that.
Sorry, go on, Tom.
Sorry, I'd echo that exactly. Our numbers as well, like Susan's, are showing that the investments going into into recovery and post-COVID stimulus, they're good big numbers, but the fraction going into clean energy investments in particular is tiny and disappointing. So there's a lot more that could be done there in terms of reorientating fiscal stimulus towards clean energy transition. And similarly, as Susan's flagged, one thing that has become clear with the COVID financing is the importance of addressing the distributional aspect. This whole transition has to get public buy-in, and the justness, the fairness of the transition is terribly important for all the financing that happens and all the new policies that are introduced.
Agreed. And I feel like that, you mentioned 18%, Susan, and I feel like that number has been kind of coming down. So the overall spend is going up, but the bit that's going towards green isn't shifting probably with the priority that we would hope for. And that part of that, I think, links to your point you made about, you talked about biodiversity and systems, and that was going to be my next question, is about we need these fundamental shifts in systems, and we talk about systems a lot, and we can't address one challenge without having an impact on another, and I think everyone's understanding of that is better with the pandemic, and we've all been talking there about how much money is or isn't being spent as we come out of that. But how do we go about that systemic change? How do we tackle issues systemically? Susan?
Well, we can't ignore it, that's for sure. They're interconnected. So exactly what you say, climate and biodiversity, we know that climate affects biodiversity, that it reduces the resilience of landscapes. It reduces those services, whether it's in terms of pollinating our food supplies, whether it's stabilizing water sources, stabilizing flooding. And the same is true that landscape destruction or pollution or overexploitation also contribute to the effects of climate change, with significant impacts on people, with impacts on health and economies. So we've seen this over and over again, and we have to look at them holistically. I think agriculture provides a perfect example of where when you make investments in food production in ways that will be nature positive, you will reduce pollution, you'll reduce the climate impact, and you'll have a overall benefit in the long term for seeing investments of the kinds of services that nature will provide back. So businesses can certainly combine nature-friendly investments, nature-positive investments with their technologically innovative investments. We know that that's an area where right now there hasn't been enough attention. Currently, I think out of the about $133 billion a year that's spent on nature-based solutions, the vast majority, about 86% of that, comes from public spending. So it by far is much less, only about 14% that comes from private sector. So this, again, needs to be scaled up dramatically. And governments can help to provide the framework for that to happen. And businesses can help to incentivize and to raise the ambition on the pace of how quickly we can move towards that. Any business right now that's thinking about the future has already begun their transition plans. So we need to ensure that we're helping to all of us go in the same direction.
Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, to pick up that last point in particular, the fact that I think both businesses and governments are getting better at breaking down the silos and recognizing the connectivity that crosses sectors, ecosystems, and other systems. So I think that breaking down silos approach is getting better. In the energy side, for instance, we see it a lot in terms of, it's things we've been flagging up to in our analysis. In the electricity sector, you don't just concentrate on the fact that you've got to roll out the renewable energy generation as much as possible. You've also got to look at the infrastructure. You've got to look at the transmission, the distribution side, the market side. All the different parts of the chain need to be addressed to make sure that the changes you're making are actually effective and contribute to the emissions reductions you need. That's in the electricity sector. In the capital market sector, we know we need the investment, but there again, it's not just a matter of using public funds or multinational bank finance to drive forward capital investment. We've really got to look at capital market structures, the way they deal with risk, the banking sectors, and the way they look at this whole sector. And so you've got to look at all the different parts up the chain.
Great, and you've both started touching on it there, but my last question, our audience here today is businesses and governments. What's their role and in pushing these system shifts? Tom?
They could all be leading. That would be great. I mean, I mentioned earlier that already there are over 50 countries with net zero emission targets. Now, this is a great signal to everyone, both to the public who are thankful that governments are taking this seriously, and to for the businesses to realize that things are getting serious now, and they also need to adapt their business plans to be able to be complying with what they can anticipate as a better low carbon future government regime. So that's in terms of government setting the signal, there's that. there are over, I think almost 2,000 corporate net zero commitments as well from big companies around the world. And there again, there's every advantage for businesses to flag up their net zero ambitions. It's pleasing for their customers who are happy to consume from such companies, but it's also recognition that their business plans do need to change, and that they should be out there up front to be able to take advantage of the new market opportunities, but also to show themselves as valid companies entering into the second half of the 21st century.
Thank you. Susan?
Well, I think the bottom line is that it's not enough anymore just to pledge support and to make ambitious statements of commitment. It's about now actually acting and showing the progress. We know that businesses are serious when they're looking at science-based targets and they've got independent reporting, and that is showing progress along the way. We know that the window for meeting 1.5 is quickly closing, so this next decade is essential. It means there's no time anymore to delay. There's no time to continue talking. This is where we have to move from commitments to action, and we have to see that progress. We probably need to ensure that there's a focus on those areas that are going to have the biggest impact. So we should be looking carefully at the commitments of the G20. We should be ensuring that NDCs are aligned with a net zero approach, and be listening to what the public discourse is right now. Looking at some of these tremendous legal cases and these landmarks that have recently shown the direction of where the world is heading, and recognizing what is the actual cost of inaction, because it's not zero. The cost that right now of inaction is something we can't afford in the future. So as long as we recognize that, as long as we appreciate that the value of a forest is not about what you can get for the cost of the tree and the wood, but it's actually that invaluable service that we can't afford to replace, whether it's water stability, climate stability, all of the services that are provided that are even perhaps not even measured yet. That's how we have to understand the urgency of these actions and the real essential equation, and when you look at the economics of ensuring that the right steps are going forward.
Thank you. And I think that's a great call to action to end on, and advice for the leaders watching us. Thank you both so much for your reflections here today and for this conversation. Earlier today, we spoke to Ezgi Barcenas, Chief Sustainability Officer at AB InBev.
Hi Ezgi, thanks so much for joining us. So we're going to get straight into the questions, and we're talking about reaching net zero, getting it done. To reach net zero by 2050, we've got to halve emissions by 2030. Are you optimistic that that's achievable?
Yeah, I'm optimistic about the good intentions, but good intentions don't always equate to actions or good climate policy. And I know that over the next decade, we're going to meet the steepest decline. So, with the focus and the momentum that we have now that we're seeing, I think we have reasons to believe, but we all are going to have to step up and do our part.
Agreed. And as you said, business can play a big role in the climate decade, and it's going to be absolutely critical to reducing global emissions. What can business do in the short term, in the next few years, and over the decade?
Yeah, I think businesses need to look inward first for that immediate action on deep decarbonization. In 2018, we set our science-based target to reduce our scopes 1 and 2 emissions by 35% by 2025. That's in line with 1.5 degree Celsius pathway. And then across our entire value chain, 25%. Again, by 2025. So that immediately gave us that momentum to go and pursue innovation and action inside our operations and then across our value chain. I think companies are going to have to leverage that, the relationships with the value chain, the partnerships we have with our suppliers. We can't do it alone, so we're all going to have to learn from each other.
Agreed, and that takes to the next question really, which is, we've talked in this event about system change and the need for big systemic change. What role do you see for AB InBev in that?
Yeah, a just transition is crucial for effective climate action, and I think businesses like ABI can and should advocate for a just and equitable transition that can bring in innovation, growth, and improve livelihoods as well while creating jobs. So I think setting the targets and pursuing those targets will be key. In our case, our ambitious 2025 sustainability goals, we've got a 100% renewable electricity target that we're making really good progress on, taking a market by market approach. So for me, that will be key. Again, mobilizing the supply chain, continuing to engage suppliers will be very critical. We have an Eclipse program that is a collaboration platform with our suppliers. We've got over 80 suppliers that have subscribed to it so far, and we are working with them to co-innovate and really influence our supply chain. And that's upstream. If you look downstream, in our retailers, we're partnering with our retailers as well to bring in renewable electricity to them. The emissions in retailers represent about 20% of our entire carbon footprint. So huge opportunities there for us to share our learnings in renewable electricity, and we can cascade those learnings to our retailer partners around the world.
Yeah, that collaboration point is really interesting. I'd love to know any more you can say on that. And is that a mindset shift that businesses have to undergo to get into collaboration?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we're seeing a lot of momentum right now. Our value chain partners are more engaged than ever before. I think there's a lot of really good intention. I think there's a lot of willingness to collaborate and appetite for innovating and sharing those innovation pipelines with each other. And I think the other big opportunity for companies like ours would be, how do we engage with our consumers? In our case, one of our global brands, Budweiser, continues to champion climate action through renewable energy. And, with every Budweiser that is brewed with 100% renewable electricity, we're giving that consumer a choice, a conscious choice to opt for a greener brand. So again, there's huge opportunities for us to engage across our entire value chain and create that momentum.
Great, and I was a big fan of the Budweiser ad with the dog leaning out of the window through the landscape. That was great. I think your Super Bowl ad, wasn't it, last year? It was great. So our theme this year for Climate Week is getting it done. From your perspective, what's your advice to others, whether it's governments, businesses, individuals? How can they get it done?
Mm-hmm. Coupling long-term ambitions and visions with short-term actions will be key and will be critical in us getting it done. That's what we're doing at ABI. We have those targets by 2025, but we're not stopping there. We're mapping out decarbonization pathways to get to that net zero ultimately. So collaboration, the pursuit of innovation, co-innovation will be key, but we will also need the bold policies.
That's great. Ezgi, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for all your support for Climate Week NYC.
Thank you, Helen.
And we're joined now by Catherine McGregor, the CEO of ENGIE. Welcome, Catherine. Good to have you with us. Now, our event is all about the critical milestones which must be met in the decade ahead for us to halve emissions by 2030. So what will be ENGIE's contribution to this very important global mission?
All right. Thank you very much for this such an important questions. And it's nice to be here and interacting with you. So really two sides for me to that question. The first thing is what ENGIE is doing itself and its own ambition for carbon neutrality. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And the second thing, which is very complementary, is what ENGIE is doing for its customers. And I would go as far as saying for its society, for the society. So maybe on the first angle, it's really around setting ambitious goals on carbon neutrality, which we have decided to reach by 2045. And this to cover all scopes, so 1, 2, and 3. And for a company that continues to sell natural gas to our customers, that means, yes, that we include our sold products in that carbon neutrality. So just to give you a little bit of a taste of how stringent our ambition is and how transforming this journey is for us at ENGIE.
So can I say to you what people sometimes say? How can a natural gas company or a company with a large chunk of gas in its mix possibly achieve this goal of decarbonizing by 2014? For having such a goal, it's just a dream. It's not possible. Well, how do you respond?
Yeah, I respond by saying that, first of all, it's a journey. It's going to take some time. We're going to have some intermediate milestones. we're going to decarbonize our whole energy mix. We're going to increase our renewable generation by a lot. And on the gas side, of course, we are going to work both on switching our products, but also decarbonizing the gas. And for that, we have today solutions. So biomethane, for example, which is a reality here in France, which is a natural gas, but it is existing. So it's a little bit carbon coming from a circular economy, if you like, which is a great substitution to natural gas today. And then, of course, looking a little bit forward to the potential of hydrogen, which remains a gas, very, very versatile, loads of potential, but is part of the solution as far as gas is concerned.
So let's just look at those separately then, Catherine. Greening gas. So many experts say, we should just turn our back on gas. It really does not have a place as a fuel of the future. What do you say to them? Why are you so committed to it still?
Yeah, I'm very committed to gas because it has a very specific properties. It has very specific properties, including the ability to be stored at scale, to be stored for a long time, and to offer something which is very precious these days, which is flexibility to the energy system. And that is extremely important because, as you know, energy systems are getting transformed. You have the ramp up of renewable energy, which we're obviously welcoming, and we're very active in that. We like that. We engage, we're pushing for that. At the same time, it brings instability to the energy system. And the gas, because of its ability to be dispatched on a very short notice, to be stored, to be transported, high density in terms of energy is a very important complement for the renewable energies, at least for the short term. And here I'm talking about natural gas. So gas as a vector is very important. So natural gas in the short term and then a greener gas in the longer term, in our mind, is extremely important to keep the energy system of the future robust, resilient, affordable. And here I really want to insist on the affordability of this energy transition. It is so important. Every day is now power price remind us that it is extremely important to think how we are going to transform this energy mix in an affordable manner. Otherwise, we will go through a wall. So in my mind, really, it's this flexibility that gas brings, storability, dispatchability, that makes it a very important component for this energy transition to remain affordable.
Hydrogen has been getting a huge amount of attention, one might even say hype, over the last few years, but it's a long way from being commercially viable. What do you think it's going to take in terms of investment, in terms of technology development, to make it really bankable and scalable?
Yeah, and you're right. Hydrogen is extremely exciting because it has this versatility. It is also a gas. So it has a role to play in this whole construction of the new energy system. It is also a very important solution to decarbonize some sectors where, frankly, solutions are not obvious. So very, very excited about the potential of hydrogen. Now, you've heard maybe the expression of the chicken and egg. It comes to, how do you kickstart a hydrogen economy? And for this, you're right, a lot of stars need to be aligned. You need technology. You need affordable, renewable energies, and especially when it comes to green hydrogen. So cheap, renewable electricity is very important. You need technology that also needs to become more affordable. And then another aspect, which is around policy, market design, incentive, potentially incentive to kickstart pilot projects, and then regulatory framework that gives private sectors the visibility that obviously we need in order to invest for the long term in projects like hydrogen. But I'm personally very excited about it. I believe that there is a lot of excitement, but concrete actions are happening. So yeah, let's watch the space.
And what about ENGIE itself? You started our conversation by saying you have committed to decarbonise by 2045, and you yourself have to make sure that you strip out the emissions within your own business. What are you doing right now, not in 2045, but right now, this year, next year, the year after, to make sure that you're steadily making progress on those commitments?
So we're investing massively in renewable energy. So we are developing a renewable electricity capacity. We have very strong ambition. Today, we are operating roughly 32 gigawatts of renewable energy. We're going to be operating 50 gigawatts by 2025, and then 80 gigawatts by 2030. So just to give you an idea of the scale of our ambition. We also have ambition in terms of green hydrogen production. By 2030, we want to have around 4 gigawatts of green hydrogen being produced. We also have ambition because we have a large infrastructure which we want to make sure we can reuse, and we feel that we can adapt this infrastructure for hydrogen, whether it's storage or transportation. And so we have set ourselves also goals in terms of hydrogen storage and hydrogen transportation by 2030.
Catherine McGregor, thank you so much for joining us to share out your plans on Climate Week NYC.
Very nice to talk with you. See you soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Joining me again in the studio is Helen Clarkson, and with her Simon Glynn. Welcome, Simon. He's partner and co-lead of climate and sustainability at Oliver Wyman. Now, they have jointly come together to work on a report called Getting Real. It's a great name, but what does it really mean? And how will this report make a difference, Simon, given that we get so many?
Thank you. Yes. Well, we've had an amazing opportunity to talk to some of the corporations who are turning their commitments on climate into action, and that's really what we wanted to focus on. That's where the Getting Real comes from. Getting Real is also, of course, we're experiencing with climate change itself. And there's two other bits to it that have really come out during the report. One is that although they're doing some amazing things, a lot of the things companies are doing at the moment are somewhat at the edge of the company, or they're done at an experimental level. And how do you really scale up? How do you move that to prime time? So that's one big part of the Getting Real message. And the other is when you talk to people about why they're doing these things, a lot of it is because they're anticipating regulation that isn't there yet. And so getting that real, sort of the message to policymakers of making that regulation real, is really critical if the momentum's going to stay.
Interesting. Helen, now you've been in this space a long time. What do you hope that businesses will take away from this report, Getting Real?
Yeah, well, I think the critical thing is the urgency. As Simon said, we're seeing all these impacts of climate change, and we've seen a real shift in the last couple of years to lots of companies making these long-term commitments, and that's great. But it's not enough, because we've actually got to start acting. And I think there's a temptation. You set your big long-term commitment, you tell the world about it, but actually, what are you doing tomorrow? What are you doing next year? We've really got to up the pace, as Simon says.
So you've got a couple of big themes in this report. Simon, I want to ask you about one of them. Own the problem, don't offload it. So that sounds like a great slogan, but what does it mean in practice? Make it real for us.
It's really the mindset with which you go into this. So we see a lot of companies coming into this with a sort of a risk mindset, which is critical, and it's a part of it. But that's the story of what's climate change doing to you? How's your company going to thrive and survive in this? The other mindset is the impact mindset. It's the one that says, based on who I am, what I do, what's the impact that I can have? How can I actually change this and contribute to this? And so that's the sort of one way you look much more broadly. You own the problem all the way along the value chain. Sounds a bit altruistic, but it's not, because that's actually where the big commercial opportunities are as well.
So are you seeing evidence for this? Do you think there are companies out there that are meaningfully owning the problem?
Yes, if we run campaigns like RE100, which is 100% commitment to renewable electricity, and EV100, which is commitment on electric vehicles, and the hundreds are really critical there, because if you said, we'll make a 95% adjustment, that would be great, but everyone in the company thinks they're in that 5%, and when you set that 100% target, you see the company owning it right from the top, and then you've got to start to innovate, and we see companies hitting their goals early. We see lots of companies in the RE100 already starting to get towards 100%, and then looking for how they improve the quality of what they're producing and so on.
It's really interesting, but there aren't enough companies doing that. I presume that's one of your messages, is you can do it.
Yes, and we use those campaigns, like the 100 campaigns, to show, and we tell the stories during events like Climate Week to inspire others to do more, because we need everyone signed up to this agenda. Every business decision now needs to have climate at the heart of it.
So Simon, here's another big theme that caught my eye: innovating the business, not the technology. Where have you seen this work in practice?
So I think we've seen a lot of companies, not a lot, but some of the really impressive companies that have looked at not just the sort of operational changes they need to do, but how do they actually, reshape and look at the whole transformation going on in their sector. So we've heard from a cable maker who could have said, oh, this is just, we'll ride the rise in cables as the electricity demands go up, and that was a buoyant industry in the first place. But they've really turned themselves into a solutions business for electrification, a very different way of looking at that business. Or a car maker that's getting into software, recognizing that actually as you move to EVs, to electric vehicles, that the way they differentiate and what you need to be good at has to be different. So that's just a couple of how it really drives not just how do I operationally decarbonize, but how do I think about the business differently.
Fascinating. Simon said, how do I think about it differently? It does require a whole rethink, doesn't it, Helen? Are businesses open to this kind of radical rethinking?
Yeah, I think we've seen, if you take a company like Unilever, you saw how that really came from the top. A number of years ago, Paul Polman really saying we're going to shift the way that the company does business. And they've set very ambitious targets over the years, and then they've had to innovate in the business to meet them. And we always see them pushing the agenda forward. And as they do it, other companies look at what they're doing and follow. We'd like to see more companies like that. IKEA is another great example of a company that sort of has set out this goal around circularity. It is now working back to how do you do that? How do you make sure that that comes in place in time?
Excellent. Helen, Simon, thank you very much for introducing us to the report. I can't wait to dive into it and get to the heart of the stories. Thank you to you both. Helen is going to stay on with us now for our next guest, who needs no introduction. Earlier today, Helen sat down with Bill Gates, didn't you, to discuss his new book, a whole new project, and how he thinks we can avoid climate disaster. We're looking forward to that interview.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Bill. We've got a lot to cover in the next 10 minutes, so I'm going to get straight into the questions. Earlier this year, you released your book on climate solutions, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. So first question, in the first 2 minutes, can we avoid a climate disaster? How can we do that?
Well, I'd say the climate movement is getting more sophisticated about the policies and technologies that would allow us to get to zero. It's so hard because it's so many areas of emissions, some of which we have a clear path, like electricity generation or passenger cars, and many of which, like the industrial sources, we don't have a clear path. The best way to do it would be to just do it today's way and then use direct air capture, which is still very, very expensive. So I'm an optimist, and I've seen a lot of innovation. The Breakthrough Energies Ventures work that's funding the companies with new ideas has found an amazing set of companies that are making really good progress. So we're not there, and it's daunting. And experts like Václav Smil, who looked at the history of electricity and industrial production, point out that we've never done anything close to this. So I see momentum building, I see awareness building, but this will be the hardest thing humanity has ever done.
Agreed, and it's good to hear that optimism, and I'm with you. The momentum is really building up. What do you think the barriers are, though, to getting to net zero?
Well, the middle-income countries between now and 2050 appropriately will be building new buildings and roads, and their diets will get richer. And even if they don't get, even to half of what citizens in rich world countries take for granted, that's a lot of physical activity. And if it's substantially more expensive to do that without emissions, they'll turn to the rich countries and say, hey, why don't you subsidize this? But the way our technologies work today, that would be over $5 trillion a year. And so way beyond what's realistic. So we have kind of a deadlock unless we can use innovation to bring that total green premium down very, very dramatically. And so, we see that as we move towards the climate conference. Why would a middle income country commit when the cost either of, the costs are just so incredibly high, and the rich countries have a lot of that power to innovate, but we have to not only invent things in the lab, we have to demonstrate that these things work reliably and get the volume up so that over time the price of things like green hydrogen can come down. So it all hangs in a balance where you can accuse me of always looking at things from the innovation point of view. To me, that is the thing that will make the difference. And the last few years, there's been a lot more focus on that. In 2015, I was part of a side event, Mission Innovation, that wasn't considered mainstream. And so I think, at least on the metric of, are people aware of that? Do they see how important that is? Governments, private sector, people who fund innovative companies. We have come a long ways to the point where demonstration projects, catalyzing demonstration projects with a lot of the economic recovery money in many of the rich countries will be kind of a big thing for the next 5 years.
Yeah, and I appreciate in your book, you reminded people that, middle-income countries do deserve to grow, and as people's quality of life gets better, their emissions go up, and we shouldn't be holding people back. So it's about meeting those new emissions for the future. Can you tell us about the breakthrough energy catalyst that you're working on now? What's it up to? What are you up to?
Yeah, so the breakthrough energy umbrella encompasses all the climate work, promoting R&D, making sure we have a model of the grid so we see what transmission and storage we need for reliability. And Breakthrough Energy Ventures was the first big thing there, which is investing in those new companies. Now we have Catalyst, which is to partner up with governments and private sector and do meaningful scale demonstration projects. And we've picked 4 tough areas: sustainable aviation fuel, direct air capture, storage, and green hydrogen. And we're orchestrating we have a relationship with the European Commission, US government, UK, and then private sector companies like Microsoft and BlackRock who've come in and said, okay, we're going to partner with you. We'll provide some capital for these projects. In some cases, we have partners that will buy the output, like the green steel that is made with clean hydrogen. So that we see as the next logical step. And the timing's very good because the EU recovery money, the bills that may come through in the United States provide a lot of resources and tax credits for these scale-up projects in the hard areas, not just in electricity and passenger cars.
And can you say a bit about, we've talked there about innovation, what else we need to shift as well as technologies?
Well, the policies are key to create demand and drive volume. The 2 paradigmatic good news stories we have are how 2 sources of generation, solar and land-based wind, and lithium-ion batteries, the price came down faster than almost anyone predicted. So, we need to see, okay, what made that happen? How did you create that early demand even when the price was high? And we need to make that happen in steel and cement and beef and almost the entire physical economy. But at least we have those examples. And some of the paths involve using electricity a lot more. So the fact that we can grow the amount of electricity and yet keep it very, very inexpensive that means we have a plan, because the energy has to come from somewhere. When you stop using the hydrocarbons, you still, these are energy demanding processes. So it's that huge clean grid combined with new ways of doing things. And, it is coming together. The pandemic in a way got people focused on government's role. And they said, okay, if we're going to get our economies back on track, green projects deserve some portion of that. So we have to make sure those projects are well run. Sometimes if government doesn't engage the private sector in the right way, it can be not helpful in advancing the technology and cost reduction.
Great. And our theme for this year's Climate Week NYC is getting it done. It's about that sense of urgency. So in the short term, sort of right now, what do we need to do to avoid a climate disaster?
Well, there are trade-offs, where you have to invest now to get the benefit later. And so I'd still say that having it not be just a small group in a country, just the Green Party or just progressives that believe in this cause, I'd say that's maybe still at the top of the list, is the broad awareness and broad commitment to the cause, because we can't have a climate strategy where you have some parties in power, they do a lot, but then when you have other parties in power, then everything stops. This is hard enough to drive innovation and deployment and cost reduction in this 30-year deadline, even if there's not a single day of pause in that. And so I'd still highlight the need to engage particularly the young generation. Sadly, the U.S. is one of the worst in the issue being partisan in nature, but we need to change that.
Thank you. And thank you so much for joining us, Bill Gates. It's just been great to talk to you and to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Bill Gates, for joining us today. And that leads us perfectly into our next discussion, which is all about technology. Will technology save us? Will it get us to those important milestones by 2030? Well, I'm going to ask that very question to some people who have strong opinions on the subject. I'm joined by Judith Visa, a managing board member, and she leads on sustainability, HR and labour for the giant Siemens AG. We're joined by Angus Hegarty, President International Markets for Dell Technologies, and by Dr. Jonathan Foley, Executive Director of Project Drawdown. Welcome to you all. So, big question. Will technology get us to our mission of halving emissions by 2030, or most of the way? Judith Visa.
At Siemens, we certainly believe that technology can play a tremendous role in getting us there. And that is actually not so much about necessarily nascent technologies or developing new ones. If we were just to really apply with political will and concerted efforts what we already have today. On the other hand, I do think that the more clarity we can give around investment conditions, things like carbon pricing, etc., setting standards around the world that will set a level playing field, I think we can redirect money investments much faster to the right places, and that in turn will spark additional innovation. But yes, technology certainly can and will be a big part of the answer.
Okay, so pretty optimistic there, I'd say, from Judith Visa. Yes, but we need more support. Angus Hegarty, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I would agree. I think, is it the answer that will solve everything on its own? No, but it is a significant enabler to the goals and objectives we have. So I would say technology can play a critical role. If you look at it, the tech sector represents about 2% of the emissions, but I think on the other 98%, it can absolutely help us to understand the climate crisis, reduce the emissions, and also capture those emissions as well too. If you look at what's happened over the last 18 months and how technology has played a critical role, in working from home, studying from home, many of the activities that would have required travel, be it international, be it within the country, that has played a significant part in demonstrating what technology can do and how we can reduce emissions and how we can work in a way that is better for the climate and environment. That's just one example. I'm sure we'll get into to many others. One last point would be the Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative has highlighted that 103 of the 169 Sustainable Development Goals can be directly influenced by technology. So the answer is yes, a significant part to play in the delivery against the goals we've set ourselves.
Okay, so we'll dive into exactly how a little later on. Jonathan Foley, Project Drawdown, I understand, is a big group of scientists mapping out in great detail how to reach net zero goals with the technologies we have today, right? So how far can these approaches take us?
Well, what's really important is technology is very, very important to addressing climate change, as our colleagues here are saying, and I agree with that. But the most important variable in all of this is time. We have to cut emissions in half roughly in a decade. That's more than the increase in emissions we've seen in the last 50 years. We now have to reverse in less than 10. So technology is great, but what we need is them to be here now. To cut emissions in the next 10 years, basically solutions must already be in the market or they're just too late. So we have to differentiate technologies that are here today versus ones that are still kind of on the blackboard or still on the lab bench, and just make sure we're careful about the time aspect of this.
Okay, so that's a really important point, Jonathan, the time aspect. And I think Judith was saying right at the beginning, there's a huge amount we can do with what we've already got. So tell us more. What do you mean, and which kinds of technologies do we already have but haven't been deployed on scale yet?
Well, our work is showing, and Judith can add quite a bit more, I'm sure, but in Drawdown, we've actually built an entire assessment of how we could stop climate change entirely with technologies available right now. Theoretically, we don't need to do anything else in tech development to solve the problem because a lot of it is solvable right now. But with today's technologies at their current costs, some of it will be painful, some of it will be expensive, but it is all doable. What new technologies can do is allow us to do it more quickly, easier, more inexpensively, and with less disruption. But it should never be an excuse not to act. To cut things in half in 10 years and then half again the 10 years after that and so on, the path we must be on requires that we cut emissions about 7.5% annually from now on until 2050. 7.5% kind of degrowth of emissions, if you will. We ought to be focusing on that and what we need to do right here, right now, with tools in hand, and just keep bringing on new tools every year.
Well, we're a long way off from that, aren't we? Because 2021 emissions have grown again, despite the pandemic, curbing effects of last year. So what can we do right now? Judith Wiese, can I ask you, what do we have that's oven ready that needs to basically be rolled out? What are you working on at Siemens that you think would be most promising?
And let me maybe start by giving you two examples. One is what we do in terms of industrial operations. We know that a lot of tasks can still be automated, probably about 60%. And by using digital technology, digital twin technology, we can actually mirror products, we can mirror processes, we can mirror entire plants and how they operate. And so the opportunity to really map out how we can save energy, how we can save resources in that regard is huge. We're working on something which is called the green...
Just explain that to me. Sorry, I didn't understand it. By mirroring, you're able to, you create a kind of shadow operation, as it were.
You take something that exists in the real world, like a product, and you basically mirror it through digital technology on a computer. So you see every component part of a product or a production process on a computer so that you can optimize either a production process and how much energy it requires, or a product and its constituent parts, and say, how much of which part has which carbon footprint.
Okay. And what kind of savings are you seeing as a result of that, Judith? What kind of savings are you seeing as a result of this mirroring process?
Oh, tremendous. The energy saving potential is tremendous. Depends on the industry, but it is fascinating what we can do, and it can be anything between 20 to up to 50%, depending on what kind of products or processes that you're talking about.
Okay.
And the green digital twin is still under development.
Okay.
But
so I want to come back and ask you
think...
about smart cities in a minute, Judith. But first, let me go to Angus and ask him what you think technologies can deliver. You said earlier that the carbon footprint of the technology sector is very low, it's only 2%. But you think that you might be able to enable the remaining 98% to work smarter. So make it real for us. I didn't understand how that could happen.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I gave one example around how technology is ensuring that we can work from anywhere. So reducing travel costs, removing emissions, all of the elements associated with that. Judith was touching on it, but edge technology, sensor technology, embedded into all our manufacturing processes, identifying how you can eliminate waste, how you can reduce energy usage, how you can maximize it. We've got, for example, a customer of ours called AeroFarms, which is using vertical farming systems, which uses 95% less water, 4% more productive. And the sensor technology is what's allowing it to do and operate in that way. The data, the insights that are driven from those sensors, improving the efficiency of production. You can apply that to any production environment, any manufacturing environment as well too. Judith mentioned digital twins and some of the work there. It means that, for example, if you're working in the aeronautical business and you want to build a plane, you don't have to spend a huge amount of carbon, energy, and activity building prototypes. You can create a digital twin and test the aerodynamics of that plane, for example. That's one example. So there's many applications. I know you're going to touch on digital cities. That's a fantastic area of opportunity that Dell Technologies is also working closely with partners. Lots of applications. It's about taking the technology and adapting it and using it in the different environments.
And Jonathan, can I ask you, is there something very obvious that we haven't discussed so far that we should be, that is oven ready, that all we need to do is deploy it now, as you were saying, to try and bring in those 7.5% a year reductions?
Yeah, I think there are some still lots of low-hanging fruit, and I love the examples that were just mentioned because they're kind of dealing with energy efficiency, material efficiency, and so on, which is really crucial that we take the current economy more or less as it is and make it as streamlined and efficient as possible while we're developing renewables and while we're rebuilding a lot of global infrastructure. That will take a lot of time no matter what we do. But some other low-hanging fruits that we need to address immediately from a climate perspective are things like methane leaks from the oil and gas sector. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and it warms considerably in a short amount of time and then kind of goes away. Dealing with methane leaks with sensors and automation in the oil and gas sector would help a lot right now. Curbing deforestation.
And sorry to interrupt, Jonathan, but this issue of methane leaks, I mean, we've been known about it for a very long time. Are you saying that this is something the oil and gas industry could have tackled? We have the technology, but they just haven't.
Absolutely,
they haven't deployed it.
They're not regulated. They don't have the economic incentive, and they're, fudging the data. They're not doing a good job with this at all. And the atmosphere's methane levels have grown considerably, especially after the kind of growth of fracking and other things in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
But also deforestation, I wanted to mention too, because that's still about 10 to 11% of global emissions is from burning down rainforest. That's almost as much as the United States emits. And yet we still aren't seriously addressing that in a lot of ways that we could be. So there are some things that we could be really tackling now that are in, electricity, in food and agriculture, industry, transport, buildings, the 5 major sectors of emissions. And I think efficiency is really important. Food efficiency, energy efficiency, material efficiency, but then shifting to low carbon ways of delivering the same services we all need in a growing, thriving world. And we can do this, but it's going to take immediate action.
So something that I think probably is not an immediate delivery, but maybe in the course of the next 10 years, is finally the realization of this idea of the smart city, which it seems to me we've been talking about for too long, but hasn't actually come into being. What are the hurdles, do you think, Judith?
Because there is no one person that will make all the decisions for a city. I think it's very often the pain point that you need to align a multitude of stakeholders and players to really be able to deliver on a smart city. At least this is one of the experiences that Siemens has had. But there is so much again that we can do already in terms of existing technology, whether that's building technology and how we can actually run buildings very, very differently, through to, of course, a very different mobility concept in terms of really changing how we either use vehicles, whether that's e-charging, autonomous, whether it is getting people more onto public transport, but then helping them with the journey from home to train and from train to where their destination is. And here again, we already have all of the technology and continuous developments around hydrogen trains, recyclable trains, for instance. And again, it's about giving a seamless consumer experience that makes a train ride more conducive, as one example.
So what do you think are the missing elements then, Angus Hegarty, in order to bring these different technologies together? Especially, I mean, if we're looking at a city, for instance, there are so many players.
Yeah. Great point. I fully agree with Judith's points in relation to the opportunity. I think it is about leadership in the country and at a city level. I think one of the things I would feel positive about, all three of us are based in Europe, and with the EU stimulus and recovery plans, a significant long-term investment is being put into two key categories. One is in technology, which is a massive enabler to the climate change and adjustments, and the Green Deal. 20% on technology and almost 40% on green and climate. This really gives the opportunity now at a country, at a city level, to really put in place the plans enabled by technology to really move forward on those initiatives. And I think also people, citizens, have a key part to play. And I think given the experience of the last 18 months, I think people realize the importance even further on climate and the opportunities they have around more flexible, more hybrid ways of working enabled by technology within our cities also is a significant contributor and can be to the reductions in climate and emissions as well too. But I would feel positive around leadership we're seeing, not just in Europe, I've given the example there, but around the world of prioritization investment at a city and country level in these two key areas.
Okay, and thank you for mentioning these big post-COVID recovery funds that are coming down the runway at us, not just in Europe, but elsewhere too. Jonathan, could I ask you, what do you think they should be prioritizing in terms of technology development and deployment?
Yeah, again, in the interest of addressing emissions immediately today, there's a temptation to do three things, and I think we need to have the right balance. One is kind of patching up our current infrastructure with better efficiency, retrofitting. There's every building on Earth needs to be retrofitted. Every furnace in the world will need to be replaced. Every internal combustion engine, every water heater. That's a huge amount of money and time requirement, but also a lot of jobs that will be created. So that needs to begin now. But as we build new infrastructure, especially transport and things like this that are billions of euros, billions of dollars, a lot of time, we need to think about these smart cities, kind of new ways of doing things. But we also need to kind of address the big issue of governance and the role of kind of shortening the distance between action and actors. If we are going to leave this up to giant bureaucracies like the UN, the EU, the US Congress, things like this, we're going to be disappointed sometimes, I think. We need to get city leaders and business leaders, investors, all kinds of leaders in the civic life to be involved in this and really accelerate action wherever it can happen and not wait for the big grand plan from above to save us. We need to do it from the bottom up as well and have them meet in the middle. And we're going to need to do all of this fast.
So, Judith and Angus, yes, go on. I want to ask you.
I was just going to add, I think it's important as well, too, from a business perspective, companies also have to step up. They need to lay out their charter, their goals, their commitments, and build not just plans with a goal that's out to 2050, to the discussion we're having, what's going to be achieved in halving to 2030, and what are the specific goals and activities we're going to do at that company level. And I think the reason why this will gather speed is consumers, customers, all of these key sectors we've been talking about are looking to work with companies who are driving the reduction in emissions, driving clearly improvements around climate and climate change as well too. Their products, their services, their capabilities need to match that. In our company, Dell Technologies, we've laid out that strategy for the next 10 years with very clearly publicly communicated on an annual basis progress towards those goals. And I'm seeing more and more companies across not just the tech industry, but across all sectors really playing a part. It needs to start with leadership at the business custody and clearly enabling citizens and individuals to also change behaviors as well too.
Can I add a point here?
So there are some companies that have made some very ambitious targets for decarbonising by 2045, 2050. I think yours might be amongst them, Siemens and Dell. But that's about a fifth of major corporations. How do you get the message across to the rest of the corporate world that this is something that they can do, that they should do, it's good for themselves, for the planet? What is your message? A fifth is not enough.
My message, to finish up my point, is that it is a business imperative and it has a direct impact on the success of your company and the growth for the future, because your consumers and your customers will choose you because of what you are actually doing, not stating what you will do, but what you're actually doing. For us, we see it as a business imperative and central to our business strategy as a company.
Judith, do you agree with that? Is it?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say I can only echo or ditto that. And for us, we're not one of the heavy industries, but we have solutions to offer to our customers. So sometimes it's also about just raising awareness and educating people of how they can actually easily make investments that will help them from a cost perspective and competitiveness perspective, but at the same time make a contribution to the environment.
So there's a question I want to ask you, Jonathan, about mindsets and the responsibility of the consumer, all of us really, in bringing about change. We hear from people that really, if we all were determined to change, we would effect huge change and transformation. But is that really possible, given that we seem so powerless in the face of the technological solutions around us, the social and political structures around us? What is your view on that?
Well, again, I think we need to shorten the distance between these climate actions and today and time, but also to us as individuals and different forms of leadership. When we make long-term goals that are set out to 2050 or 2040, they're not really genuine in my perspective. I want to see companies and cities and countries have goals for this year and next year, just like you would for financial performance, for everything else we do. Let's make this accountable now for those goals, 8% this year, not something about 2040. Same thing with our own actions. It's very easy for us as individuals just to point our fingers at the oil companies and say they're all to blame. Well, some of that's really true, but not all of it. We consumers also have power in the system as well, not all on our shoulders either, but the choices we make about the kind of home we buy, the kind of cars we drive, the kind of food we eat, do matter, and it's just as powerful as voting for different political voices as voting with your pocketbook, with your wallet, and sending signals to the market and to business and to leaders and to the rest of society. So I think all of us have some responsibility in the system to play our part as individuals, as leaders, as academics, as journalists, as everyone, to help do what we can in this larger system, not all of the responsibility, but a little part and a role to play. But also keep our mind on what is doable right now and just get to work. Talking about it and kicking the can down the road or putting the responsibility on someone else isn't going to get it working done.
So I'm going to ask Judith and Angus, obviously, following on from Jonathan, what are you doing right now at Siemens and at Dell to try and change the way in which you're bringing down your emissions this year? Could I ask you that first, Judith?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like Angus pointed out, we have a program out there that we call the Degree program. Is our version of ESG. Very much focuses on the two planetary dimensions, on decarbonization, but also resource efficiency. I gave you one example which we're currently developing for customers, but we need to apply for ourselves as one is the green digital twin technology. We're striving towards carbon-free buildings. economies and have a very clear roadmap that we've worked backwards from 2030 as well. We have tackled the question of car fleet. We just had an announcement out in Germany that on the status cars, we're now following a very different path. And renewable energy sources are obviously important for us. And again, here we have our own technology, the microgrid technology that we own and have as part of our portfolio, means that we can actually feed in more renewable energy and therefore decarbonize, because the grids are more stable and resilient than some of the bigger ones.
Angus?
And in Dell Technologies, I mentioned earlier on, we've laid out a commitment by 2030 for net zero emissions, 2050, I should say. For 2030, we have a set of goals that we're measuring and reporting annually, and to Jonathan's point, with metrics and tracks against them. Things like all our packaging be recycled, the take back of technology as new technology goes out to market, ensuring that we're reusing and reuse of technology within the products up to 50%. So setting out very clear goals in relation to that. We're also mobilizing our team members. They have a passion for the climate. They have a passion for these areas, and getting them engaged and involved through our network groups that we call Planet, and out into the communities in which we work and live. These are some of the kind of key areas that we're targeting to drive and to achieve over that period of time.
You know, one of the bugbears that consumers have, Angus, is that tech products have such a short shelf life. You know, within 2 or 3 years, you almost have to replace them. And then what happens to that bit of kit? It's and is that something that you're addressing?
Brought back, recycled and reused. A commitment to do that for every piece of technology that we ship out, we'll take back an equivalent piece of technology. So the circular economy around technology and the reuse of those parts and hardware back into the system. That's a clear commitment. Same as some of the other points that I mentioned as well too. And they're goals that we report on. And we're also seeing it from our customers into the RFPs and into the requests for quotation on technology. They're now putting a weighting on elements around emissions, commitments, programs, initiatives, and not just information, but actually weighting the decision making. And this is really important. We'd like to see more of that in the public sector, RFPs and initiatives on technology. I think that's an important part as we look to things like the Green Deal in Europe and elsewhere around it, to make sure that our public procurement is also prioritizing working with companies who are clearly driving to these reductions in climate and improvements in emissions.
Jonathan Foley, I see you nodding over there.
Yeah, I mean, what I like to hear, Angus made this point earlier too, is that technology companies themselves are relatively small emitters in the big scheme of things, but they help enable a lot of other industries to be better. And so I really like this approach of working inside the company itself and your own supply chain and process to decarbonize that as much as you can, as quickly as we can. That's great. But also, you guys are tool providers, you know, essentially. And if you can give better tools to the world, this is a really great leverage point for the tech sector to be enabling a lot of good transformation. And so I think that's very, very important, whether it's you know, Siemens, Dell, but companies like Google and Microsoft and others, they have the capacity to go out and really change the way we all work and maybe enable us in the larger economy outside the tech sector to be also cutting emissions quite quickly.
So sometimes when I think about the scale of the challenge ahead, it's very easy to get rather depressed about it. But I want us to finish on a positive note. So I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball, please, and give me a picture of what you think 2030 will look like in terms of the way in which we as consumers live our lives, the way in which businesses will operate, the way in which we will receive our power and make our decisions of how to get from A to B. Take it away. Who should start? Angus.
Well, I think from our company point of view, when you say something like 2030, we have a clear vision for our technology business and company, that, you know, we will have 100% of all of our products from a recycling packaging perspective. We'll take back one product for every single other product. We'll be a long way on our journey. We'll have reduced the energy consumption of our products significantly in the last decade. We've reduced that by 80%. But to Jonathan's point, I'd finish on that companies would look to technology to be a great enabler to their business to reduce the energy, to increase the efficiency, to create flexibility around where you work, and net overall reduce the emissions and have a very positive impact on the climate.
Judith, will we be living in smart cities by 2030? I can't wait. What would it look like if we were to be?
I think that by 2030, mobility, for instance, is going to look absolutely differently. So I think we've already reached a point of no return, at least in Europe, I would say, and I would guess in Asia as well on the type of mobility in terms of electrical vehicles, autonomous drive. I think is going to be there by then, and again, public transport is going to look very differently. So I have a clear hope for cities having become much smarter and how people move about them much smarter. Yes.
And Jonathan, I'm going to ask you to end our discussion with your most optimistic and visionary hat on. What are our lives going to look like in 2030?
Well, the good news is we do have solutions to climate change really at our fingertips, and more are coming every day. So it's natural to be anxious and depressed, feel that, hold that for a while, process that, but then let's start to act and make sure that we deliver on the promise of the future. We have the ability right now to really still create a beautiful and amazing and prosperous and equitable future for the world. That ability still exists, and we just have to choose it. And that's the most limiting issue, is just the choices we make. Are we going to build the world we are capable of, or are we not? So I think by 2030, we'll seize that opportunity and really see not only are we addressing climate change, we're making our lives better. We're making things better for everyone. Our health will be better. Our economies will be stronger and more resilient. We can address longstanding issues around equity and justice and race and economic disparity. We can help close the gap between rich and poor. We can make the world so much better by moving from our 19th century kind of the world that we're still living in too many ways to a truly 21st century world. And I can't wait. I think it's going to be brilliant. And I think once we start to do it, we're going to wonder what took us so long. This is fantastic.
I can't wait either. Thank you very much for ending us on an optimistic note and for a very inspiring conversation. Jonathan Foley, Angus Hegarty, and Judith Visa. It's been a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so we've ended with optimism, but we need to start developing those technologies right now, as we heard from Jonathan Foley, and we've got to start decarbonising every year by 7.5%. That's a tall order. And now, for our closing remarks, I'm delighted to say we're joined by the First Minister of Scotland, the Right Honourable Nicola Sturgeon, and she joins us from Edinburgh.
It's now just over 1 month until the start of COP26 in my home city of Glasgow. That summit represents the world's best chance, possibly our last chance, of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And it therefore promises to be one of the most important gatherings of the century so far. Scotland is determined to do everything we can to ensure a successful outcome. We believe that states, regions and devolved governments, and also businesses and investors, have a vital role to play in making this summit a success. After all, we are essential to delivering the transition to net zero, and our voices can help spur UN member states to raise their ambitions. Scotland already tries to lead through the power of our example. We have more than halved our emissions from 1990 levels. Over the decade to 2030, we aim to halve them again. And by 2045, we are committed to achieving net zero. We're also working to ensure that our transition is a just one and that no communities are left behind. In all of this, Scotland is determined to work with and learn from partners across the world. That's why I'm proud to be the European co-chair of the Under 2 Coalition of states and regions. Scotland recently established an initiative to support other coalition members in setting net zero targets. It's also why I'm delighted to contribute to Climate Week NYC. Events like this are an essential part of the build-up to Glasgow. They encourage collaboration, they help all of us to raise our ambitions, and of course they're a source of good ideas, new insights and fresh inspiration. All of that will be needed in the months ahead. So thank you to everyone who has taken part in this week's events, and let's all of us keep working for a successful, ambitious and just outcome to COP26 in Glasgow.
Thank you to Nicola Sturgeon, and that important message brings our event to a close. From all our sessions today, it's crystal clear. We have the solutions, we have the technologies, so let's just get it done. We're less than 40 days from one of the critical moments of this climate decade, COP26. Let it not be the finish, but the starting line in the race to halve emissions by 2030. The energy transition is, of course, vital, but it's not the only system we must shift. We need a full systems approach, and that requires businesses, governments, investors, and most importantly, you, to take action today. Thank you for joining us today, and remember, we have more than 18 events on the Hub Live. So please do visit the website, find out what's going on, get involved, and let's get it done.